I try to summarize my whatever 10 minutes comments. I would say that the agricultural revolution is ongoing. It was about 11,000 years ago, but it is ongoing our days, and the future looks even better. So this is a short summary. As soon as I knew that Professor Diamond received the Wolf Prize, I immediately approached him and invited him to my new home, the Faculty of Humanities, and he enthusiastically responded, and I thank you very much, Jared. For over 40 years, I was studying plant biology and agricultural biotechnology, but suddenly the thunder struck, and I found culture research even more rewarding in a way. In fact, it's the combination of two. In the last paragraph of his very recent book, the last or the most recent book, it's not the last, it's the most recent book, which is called, for you, some of you that are not aware, no, please put on the line, which is entitled The World Until Yesterday. In the very last part, Jared writes that some of our societies, I was making it short, achieved world dominance for specific reasons. Their technological, political, and military advantage derived from their early origins of agriculture, as you just heard. And the explosion here, the population explosion in this hall, is due to agriculture. And of course to Professor Diamond. Otherwise, we wouldn't be so many as we are now on this planet. 7 billion, reaching soon 10 billion people. Jared described beautifully the origins of agriculture and domestication. Today I would like to add just a few comments on the continuous survival of agriculture, in effect on the renaissance of agriculture. Because as I see, it is evolution through scientific and cultural revolutions. As you can see on this slide, if we look at the timeline of history, starting from 10,000 BC, we had an eruption of scientific revolution, domestication of plants and animals. Then there was a standstill for hundreds of years. Nothing very much happened in agriculture. More and more people were born, more and more food was produced, but nothing critical, revolutionary really happened. Then in about 1850, 1820, with the Industrial Revolution, fertilizers came into being. And with fertilizers, there was a big jump in the capacity to produce food by plants, and of course to grow animals which eat plants. Then again, a period of not very much, until the time when Gregor Mendel founded the basis of genetics, which was rediscovered only 50 years later in the US, and we started to breed intentionally to have better foods and better crops and better animals. Then another revolution, and this was the scientific revolution of the molecular area. We have been celebrating just last week 60 years to the double helix by Crick and Watson. This is the new era, and it is another revolution in agriculture. So this is why I mentioned that agriculture is invented every time and again, and it is going on. Looking at the other line, it parallels quite well the development of biotechnology. Thousands of years ago, production of bread, wine, beer, these are biotechnologies. Then the immunization systems by Pasteur, These are biotechnologies. So history, but of course the production of transgenic engineered animals and plants. This is by definition a revolution. So the revolution is going on, and otherwise, the first one being of course the domestication, otherwise we couldn't survive in this world. I think it was Malthus that first was calling for the doomsday. He saw the doomsday when there will be many more people that the earth cannot survive and not enough food. In fact, Malthus theories are doomed only because those revolutions. I can say in few words that the last 10,000 to 15,000 years of plant-human cultural coexistence and co-evolution. It is human-plant coexistence and co-evolution. Those 10 to 15,000 years ago are a central cultural cornerstone in two outstanding epochs. The one about 11,000 years ago, which we just heard, the agricultural revolution, the domestication. The second one is old only few, maybe 30, 40 years of the molecular revolution. So these two very impressive revolutions are in a way guarantee that the world is not doomed. Let us take for example the story of the potato. I'm trying to find now where to put it. Probably here. No? Let's take, for example, the story of the potato. Potato was domesticated about 6,000 years ago, roughly, in the Andes, somewhere Bolivia and Peru. Then with the conquistadors, it went all the way from Peru to Europe. At about the 18th century, some scholars say that potato yields that were domesticated again or redomesticated in Europe were responsible for about 1/3 increase in population of Europe due to the potato that came all the way from Peru to Europe. So it's not only a revolution, it's continent-to-continent movement of genes. Because only with the discoveries of the new world, of new countries, genes could come together and new varieties could arise. This is another reason or another justification for figuring that the revolution is ongoing. How is agriculture related to survival, to human existence? Very simple. I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre who first coined the slogan, existence precedes essence. This was the basis of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. And what is existent? The primary demand for existence is, of course, food. It is agriculture. There is no existence without food. And another reason for thinking, for looking at the fact that it is ongoing, and if we are moving on from the 7 billion to the 10 billion people, we have to improve it. I don't have time to go further about it, but let me just tell you, out of the 1.4 billion hectares of arable land, this is what we have worldwide, about 1.5 billion hectares of arable land. About 13% out of it, which is about 18 million hectares, are being used to plant GM, that is genetically modified plants. Just last year in 2012. out of those 18 million hectares, the majority are growing by only 6 countries: United States, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, India, and China. On the list of those countries, there are no any priorities to Europeans. The priority is for science. And as was just mentioned, I really admire the way that you're putting it, that no one can see what is in the brain. This is why Argentina, Brazil, and China and India, due to scientists who are educated everywhere in the world, are now producing a large amount of new crops, of new plants to feed the world, to bring down, to make the Malthus theories quite doomed. I know there are quite large problems with it. People are discussing it, but the fact is there. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. As far as food is concerned, the world is not doomed. Given, of course, the fact that the agricultural revolution will go on. In fact, it's a biological revolution. It's a biotechnological revolution. It is due to what is here inside, as Professor Diamond was putting it. On the contrary, the physical standards of existence are continuously improving. Believe it or not, we are used to hear about the poor people in Africa and India, but generally speaking, the physical standards of existence are continuously improving, and in great part thanks to the scientific revolutions. There are many, or there are less hungry people nowadays in China, in India, than there were 20 years ago. There are less. Yes, there are problems in Africa, but the problems are due not to problems in the technique, but to governmental, ethical, and other problems. I'll now finish by saying another word on the future. There are now talks on bionic limbs, on brain-inserted chips to improve memory. This is the future of technologies. But future biotechnologies, or in high-tech, must first and foremost affect the increase in nutritional food of biofortified food. The bionic limbs are for the rich people. The so-called bionic food is for the everybody, for the people, for the poor people. So what we are depending now, and I'll finish by this, is we are depending on domestication of new technologies. This is domestication in its best. Domestication of biotechnologies and new technologies for continuing the revolution that started about 10,000 years ago and was so beautifully described by Jared Diamond. Thank you.
I invite all Tel Aviv University students to enroll to Professor Altman's seminar on the burgeoning of culture next year, second semester, at the Unit of Cultural Research. There you will be able to hear more details about those fascinating subjects we started to discuss now. And calling upon Professor Gidon Bigger, Department of Geography, Tel Aviv University.
Thank you very much, and special thanks to Professor Diamond, which did the impossible thing to, as he present in 40 minutes, the whole history of the world. Especially, I like it because it presents mainly to the role of geography on this. And his last remark, of course, if Professor Even-Zohar invited you to come to the lecture there, we invite all of you to go to learn geography in order to understand what's going on here. Well, I more like to present questions and remark, not any kind of small lecture concerning what we heard. Now, as an historical geographer, which is my profession, I always ask question of where it was and why it was where, and as partly historian, why it was at this particular period. Now, we heard from Professor Diamond a lot of answer concerning where and why where. Why only on these 9 points of the world this domestication took place. One thing that, of course, was not answered, maybe because of the time, is why it was made in that particular period. Why certain thousand years ago and not 15,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago? Is there anything concerning the environment that did it only at that period? Because as we heard, human race is wandering on this earth for nearly some even say more than 2 million years. Why particularly certain years, thousand years ago it improved? And if made it too more narrow, we heard that it started in the Middle East. Only 2,000 or 3,000 years later, it started in China. We heard about the potato long time after it was done there. Why? Is there anything in the environment, maybe change of climatic condition, maybe change of other environmental area, which produce it not at the same time in the same place? So this is questions that can be asked why it was there. I don't have any precise answer. I just know a little bit from research that I have done here in Tel Aviv University that at least during the last 10,000 years there were no real climatic change in this area, which is of course not as it was in Europe, mainly Central and Northern Europe, even Northern America. So can it be that the answer is the stabilizing of the climatic change? Because before we had different climatic, different environmental, I would say, condition, and around certain thousand years before our time, it was stabilized. So maybe this was it. I don't really know what happened in China or in the Andean concerning this, but as this might be the cause here, this can be one answer. Now, another question rose that we held, I would say, the ladder of development. First, they were gatherer, hunter, then came the agriculture, and they produced later on the urban society and the modern societies that we have now. This is something that we know, I say know, that from the 19th century onward, this is the main idea of how human race were developed. But if one look at history, we know that in a lot of cases, I would say, the wandering people conquered the settled area. It was done during the, let's say, the Muslim rights from Central Arabia and conquered part of the world. It was done even later on when the Mongols came from Mongolia, also with domesticated horses, but without there any agriculture, the same as the Arab. If we go earlier, the German tribe that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire, really destroyed it, they didn't come with some sophisticated and modern agriculture. They were also gatherers, they were have here, there some small, but they conquered the most sophisticated empire of its time with its full developed agriculture, domestication, and so on and so forth. So we know that in some area, those who produced themselves or became agriculturists after some centuries or some decades go back to be nomads because they like to do it. So this ladder which go as going from this step to this step to this step is, if you look at different period, different time, different area, it's not as simple as we heard now. There are a lot of other questions that can be asked here, but it's again go back to notions that already developed in the 19th century, and Professor Diamond already presented with the say, hush, 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 don't say this. Why the European were so successful, the European, the age, the eras, and let's just recall that human race started in Africa, go into Europe, they could go back. Why it was there, why it didn't come back to Africa, or why it was not developed in Africa during the 2 million years that people lived there, or human race in different kind. So one can say, okay, America is not connected to, and in order to make connection, you have to have the technical revolution of the development of the ship that and the boat that can transfer, although we know that the Viking entered America 500 years before Columbus. They didn't settle there, they settled and destroyed. So the dates is there, it doesn't give any answer, maybe because they came to Central America, the Spaniard, while the Viking gone to North America. So there are a lot of questions concerning this. As partly historian, just one last note to this and then to conclusion, I will not take 1492 as the point, I will take 1521. And why? What's the difference between this and this? In 1521, the first ship that goes from Spain in the voyage of Magellan returned after 4 years after signaling the whole world. From this point, globalization started. Because up to this, it was only here and there, but this importance of this, for me, as historical geography, is the most important. So we ask just the question, are we determinist theories that we heard here, that everything rely on the environment, everything rely on what was called in the past geography, or we are living in a possibilities era when human race can, by its achievement, try to change the landscape. As I said in Hebrew, later in English, as we know in Hebrew there are some things that prevent by poet, not by a scientific, although he was a doctor, and I asked about Shaul Chernichovsky, the poet, they say that Ha'adam hu tavnit nof moladeto. This is deterministic idea that human race is created by environment. But if we look at the different area, especially even here in Israel, I would say that our landscape of today was created by people, which say that the environment is the creation of the human race. So, again, are we determinists, as we heard here, or are we possibilities? I cannot give an answer as the whole world, but there are a lot of questions, although, thank you again, Professor Diamond, for what you have, because your idea inspired us to ask questions that we never asked before. Now you present us with this, and we have that. Thank you very much.
We go on, moving to Professor Avi Gofer, coming from the depth of prehistorical archaeology, Tel Aviv University.
Shalom לכולם. Good evening, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. It seems to me that I'm the only one that was really intimidated by Itamar, and he told me, you have 7 or 8 minutes, and you're allowed a few pictures. And I took him seriously, and I did. So, I'm going to read my 7 minutes so that I don't use too much time. And the other thing about this short presentation is that not like everybody before me, I'm not going to talk about the whole world and try to generalize. I'm going to talk about a very specific event or process of domestication that happened in this region about 10,500 years ago. So, while the global level shows a series of independent centers for plant domestication, as you can see in this map that possibly Professor Diamond knows very well, this global picture basically irons out the regional details. Over a decade ago, fascinated by new results of genetic studies, we suggested a model for plant domestication in the Levant that may be called the core area one event model. In simple words, what we said in this is that plant domestication has taken place in a limited, well-defined core area in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. A small core area, no more than 300 kilometers in diameter. We also said that it was a knowledge-based and conscious process. And we said that it was a fast process, or if you want, basically, a punctuation. This was by no means a new idea, but it was based on improved geobotanical data, a rich and growing bank of archaeobotanical data, genetics of relevant packaged species, and meticulous archaeological work with a detailed record of radiocarbon dates. An opposing model that gained the support of many in the 2000s is the protracted autonomous model. This is a model for plant domestication in the Levant, which in simple words says that for the Levant, the domestication of a package of immense ingenuity and success, including wheat, barley, lentil, pea, chickpea, bitter vetch, and possibly horse bean too, all of which play a major role in world economy to this very day. They say it was a protracted, millennia-long process taking place independently in many different centers of the Levant, and most importantly, it was an unconscious process, a prehistoric accident, so to speak. Apart from the scientific aspects, this model pronounces a certain Western sense of superiority that tends to ignore the amazing capabilities of hunter-gatherers of the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene, and their legacy of very close and educated acquaintance with landscapes and plants. Let me point out briefly a few aspects of our core area one event model mentioned above. I'll start with the core area, which I'll show you again, and say a few points. One is that all progenitors of the packaged plants are presented in the core area, shown here in a green circle. It's found in core area sites starting in the late Natufian and during the PPNA, or the beginning of the Neolithic period, in their wild form. Domestic types appear since the very beginning of the Prepottery Neolithic B, what we call PPNB, that is some 10,500 years ago. The third point is that genetic markers for einkorn and emmer, wheat, and the geobotany for chickpea and other studies for lentil and pea indicate that the domesticated populations originated in the core area around the Karachadag mountain in southeastern Turkey. Barley is a more complex story. However, northern Levant origins are not ruled out. The last point, archaeological finds in the core area show major cultural centers and the spread of cultural innovations, including technology and materials, from the core area to the south and to the west in a pace that can be measured by carbon-14 dates. Interestingly, animal domestication in the Levant, including goat, sheep, cattle, and pigs, as shown by Zeder, and you see on the screen now, when looked at through the maps of their natural distribution and their original genetic stocks, overlap in the core area we suggested for plants, or nearly so. So that's about core area. Second point is about the knowledge-based process. The choice of species for domestication, as well as the selection for specific domestic-like genotypes in the different species must have been a knowledge-based process showing amazing ingenuity. We see no reason and no logic to an explanation viewing plant domestication as a random, unconscious process. Given the resilience of the package of domesticated plants, this is hard to accept. I'll give you just one example, which is, to my view, a good one. It's the example of the chickpea. One of the three very similar species of chickpea, the chosen chickpea species, shows a major advantage after domestication, namely the rise of the amount of the amino acid tryptophan, and this is amazingly suitable for Neolithic circumstances, which I will not enlarge on here because the time is short. I'll move to the third topic, and that's concerning pace, or how fast did this happen. Now, if one assumes consciousness, then the selection is fast, almost by definition, and may, in our view, start already in the wild. Experimental work has shown that a short, fast process of domestication is possible. Moreover, the term pre-domestication cultivation is a concept used to describe the protracted, long process of managing wild plants until full domestication. But it is basically archaeologically translucent. Pre-domestication cultivation has also logic problems, at least with some of the species of the package. I'll give you one example. Lentil. 90% seed dormancy in lentil makes it impossible to profit from cultivation unless a selection for non-dormant or low dormancy types is made in advance. This is what Gidon Ladizhinsky has termed domestication before cultivation, thus giving credit to the Neolithic domesticators. I'll end with three short notes. First one, Anybody who will Google for the domestication of plants in the Levant at any time in the last 5 years will easily notice that there is consensus on the protracted autonomous model for plant domestication. Kind of a happy story. However, if I may, happiness is dangerous for both scientists and science. And I'm saying it, I had many thoughts before saying this. Second point is, it isn't climatic deterioration that promoted plant domestication, simply because there is no articulation, and it is not demography. Demographic growth following the Neolithic demographic transition model is a result and not a mover of domestication. So it seems that push models do not work for the Levant as good as they work or may work in other parts of the world. And lastly, what we suggest is a knowledge-based, conscious, cultural move that was offered, adopted, and assimilated in a time of plenty, and in an outstandingly innovative, successful, socially active, and competitive cultural landscape. And that happened in the Neolithic in North Syria and southeastern Turkey. Thank you very much.
Professor Diamond illuminated quite wonderfully how deterministic environmental factors have shaped history and have shaped human cultures. And what I like to ask and try to answer or to suggest in a few minutes is whether this trajectory of environmental, deterministic environmental factors shaping history is a constant factor in history, and what is the future of this situation of the environment shaping history and human culture. And I would like to claim that in general, in the interaction between the deterministic environmental forces and human culture and history, as time progresses, the environmental forces become weaker and weaker, whereas the cultural forces become stronger and stronger until the system is overturned and culture and humans begin to shape and destroy, some may say, the environment rather than vice versa. And if you look at events thousands of years ago, such as the establishment of the first kingdoms, then it's quite easy to see that there are deterministic environmental forces determining why the first kingdoms arose in Egypt and Mesopotamia and not in Britain or in Scandinavia. As you move along further in history and you come, for example, to the question of the rise of universal religions, it becomes much, much more difficult to explain why the religions that conquered the world came from such places as the Arabian Peninsula and not, say, from Southeast Asia. And why, in the struggle between the different religions, it was, at least in the, say, the Mediterranean world, monotheism that prevailed over dualism and polytheism and not vice versa. It's very hard to find an environmental explanation for this phenomenon. And as we move to the modern era, it becomes even harder to explain things like the two world wars and their outcome as dependent upon deterministic environmental factors. So the environment, the force of the environment upon humans becomes weaker, perhaps, and conversely, the force of human cultures, human ideas, human ideals over the environment becomes in turn more and more strong. And it is humans who are increasingly controlling and shaping the way that the world around us looks. Until we come to this day, when we can say basically that we are running this planet, not necessarily consciously, and not perhaps very successfully, but we are controlling it and running it. If we took a census of who comprises planet Earth today in 2013, and we keep the worms and the insects and the small and the microorganisms aside and focus only on large animals who inhabit the world today. So first there is us, of course, the most important. If we take all Homo sapiens today in the world, close to 7 billion sapiens, and put them on a large scale and weigh them, how much do we weigh together? What is our biomass? So our biomass is about 300 million tons. 300 million tons of humanity occupy as a planet today. Who else is on the planet? We have the domesticated animals that we basically enslave and use for our own needs and wants according to our wishes. And they have very, very little control, less and less control over their fate. So how much are they? How much do they weigh? If you take all the cows and all the pigs and all the sheep and all the horses and llamas and so forth and put them on a large scale and weigh them, the scale will show about 700 million tons. So together we have 1 billion tons of humans and their enslaved animals. Who else is on the planet? So you have all the penguins and all the giraffes and all the rhinoceroses and all the alligators and all the whales and all the dolphins that still populate our TV screens and still populate our children's books, but they don't really populate the world as much as they did before. Because if you took all of them together and put them on a large scale, nobody really knows how much they will weigh, but the estimates are between 40 million and 100 million tons. That's all. It's less than, they are altogether less than 10%. I'm talking only about the big ones, say penguins and above, not the ants and so forth, which are much more. So we are now controlling this world, this planet. So we had a stage in which the environment largely shaped and changed man. And then we are having a phase in which man is increasingly in control of the environment. What will come next? So next, I think, this is just a suggestion, don't take it too seriously, but perhaps man will subdue and control and change the last remaining environment, which is the inner environment, the inner savanna. The real savanna out there, it's already controlled by us. It's just a tourist attraction. The only savanna which is still alive and kicking and shaping history is the inner savanna of the emotions and sensations and human traits that have been shaped by environmental pressures on the African savanna hundreds of thousands of years ago and still control us. This is the last remaining control of the wild environment over history and over humanity. And perhaps the next stage of this process is that man will subdue this environment too, with the help, we see it already today, with the help of bioengineering, with the help of psychiatric drugs, with the help of genetic engineering, with the help of creating cyborgs, direct brain-computer interfaces, and so forth. And when this happens, there will no longer be any environment, but there will no longer be any man, as we understand the term also, so we'll reach the last stage of no environment, no man, just something completely different, which nobody can even imagine what it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very encouraging vision of future. I'm very happy to have had the wisdom to put myself last in this discussion, because everybody has already paved the way to understanding the role of culture in human history. So you are all cordially invited to join the Unit of Cultural Research at Tel Aviv University, which deals with all these problems. I'll take the liberty of saying some generalizations which could very well suit into your scheme of journalistic sentences, you know, those that can be copied and pasted by journalists, but cannot resist, in the other part of my little talk, to raise two particular questions directed to all of you, but especially to our distinguished guest. We in culture research are in debt to Jared Diamond primarily for his willingness and ability to merge and juxtapose a plethora of theoretical and methodological procedures, which is what culture research is about. More particularly, we are very encouraged by at least two of his main macro hypotheses, one on the meta-theoretical and methodological level, and the other on the level of cross-cultural analysis. The first one has to do with his insistence on the feasibility, validity, and productivity of the natural historical experiment, especially by using the comparative methods. This input is of enormous significance to the sciences of man as they are carried out in the various departments of the social, human, and biological sciences. The second one is his insistence, since his very first publications up to his most recent one, I believe the most recent one was The World Until Yesterday, isn't it? That the history of human societies has been mostly that of cultural transmissions, and that both mere survival and a successful existence depend on such transmissions and are greatly endangered by isolation. Diamond's analysis is in full congruence with advances in cultural evolution, where culture is conceived of as the aggregate of solutions for the life of a species that are acquired by learning and are transmitted from one generation to the next. In cultural evolution, social learning is the main condition for the perseverance of culture, often investigated on the individual level. Diamond, on the other hand, insists on learning on the collective level, the acquisition of components of a repertoire of solution that is available from whatever accessible sources. Transmission of solutions is indispensable because without them there is no heterogeneity, namely no multiplicity of options. This heterogeneity has proven to be, through those comparative natural experiments of human history Diamond has been executing for decades, a crucial condition for survival and success. The case of the emergence and diffusion of agriculture as a whole new set of solutions for the human species is one of those perspectives Diamond has been researching in his work. Now, as I told you, I cannot resist putting two special questions. I'm not sure this is the right moment to raise some puzzling issues, but we'll do it. I will do it nevertheless. One concerns the puzzling case of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Some would say it undermines Diamond's interpretation of the chain of events started with the initiation of culture as primarily organizing large societies and governments. I do not support this view, that is, I don't believe that the Göbekli Tepe case undermines the theory in grand scale, but I wonder what Diamond himself thinks of it. The other one concerns the avenues of repertoire transmissions. In this case, the transmission of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent to Europe. We normally think of a transmission of repertoire carried away by all sorts of agents from a source to a target territory. This seems to have been the main hypothesis among historians, including Diamond. However, the persistent work of Wolfgang Hack and his group in the last decade claims to have revealed that, I quote from Hack's latest paper, when compared to indigenous hunter-gatherer populations, the unique and characteristic genetic signature of the early farmer suggests, in Europe, suggests a significant demographic input from the Near East during the onset of farming in Europe. This suggests the possibility of agricultural repertoire transmission not only, or perhaps not even mainly, through agents, but through direct migration of people who transported their repertoire with them. You know, we distinguish in cultural transmissions between the movements of repertoires without people, movements of people with their repertoires. It is moving of cultural traits without people, but normally via agents, or with people through migrations. I wonder if you consider this work to be significant in the context of the diffusion of fertile present culture to Europe. Europe got its name, as all of you know, from the Hebrew word Erev, meaning evening, meaning west. Thank you very much. As a chairperson, I now give the floor to Professor Diamond. Your last word.
Well, this is quite a challenge to respond to 35 minutes of thoughtful comments and extensions and different views in 4 minutes. But on the other hand, after one has summarized 13,000 years in one sentence, perhaps I can also respond to this rich smorgasbord in less than 4 minutes. And let me just pick out for each of the speakers 1 or 2 points that particularly engage me. In connection with Professor Altman's remarks about the agricultural revolution being ongoing and the explosion of genetic modification today, I gather that in Europe, GM crops are especially controversial. It's worth reflecting that, in fact, GM crops have been with us for 11,000 years, namely the domestication 11,000 years ago involved the genetic modification of the first crops, involved the genetic modification of wheat, to have non-shattering rachises and to have larger seeds, and involved the genetic modification of peas to be selected for non-popping genes. So we've always had genetically modified crops. What's different is that now we have genetic understanding and can do it making use of the underlying genetics. The first farmers who produced wheat selected wheat with non-shattering rachises and with larger seeds. They did not know about the genes controlling the rachises and seed. Nevertheless, they ended up with genetically modified crops without the benefit of modern genetics. So that I personally don't view GM crops as a drastic threat to ethics and humanity. I regard it as using modern science for increased power to do what we've been doing for 13,000 years. And so I'm in sympathy with you in your essential point that today things are going faster and faster. And they're going faster and faster because we got science to give us power. I don't know whether many of you here have read the novels of Sinclair Lewis, I believe. And Sinclair Lewis, in his novel Arrowsmith, concludes with his protagonist discovering physical chemistry. And about the last page of the novel has an account of physical chemistry in which the protagonist, who before that has never been a scientist, concludes physical chemistry is power. Well, science in general is power. In the remarks of Gideon Biga, my fellow geographer, let me respond to 2 points. One, the fascinating question of why did it begin 13,000 years ago instead of 15 or 20 or 60,000 years ago? Why did agriculture take off so quickly beginning 13,000 years ago? Within a short time, so agriculture took off in the Fertile Crescent, but very soon thereafter, maybe even simultaneously, it took off in China, and then it took off in 7 other areas. Well, humans have been around for 6 million years. Why wasn't the spread of agriculture in these 9 different areas spread out over the 6 million years? Why was it all bunched within a short time? A couple of things could be said about that. One is that it's frequently been discussed that at the end of the Ice Age, there was an enormous expansion of land that was not covered by ice and that was more suitable for food production. So there was probably a role of climate change at the end of the last Ice Age. But that then raises the question, the last Ice Age was the last Ice Age, and there have been now 22 previous Ice Ages. So why did agriculture not arise 50,000, 60,000 years ago at the end of an Ice Age then? Why did it not arise at the end of the 22 previous Ice Ages? And I suggest that the difference there is that while the environment changes were similar at the end of the 23 Ice Ages, there the difference was in humans, namely cognitively modern humans, biologically modern humans are something of the last 200,000 years, and cognitively modern humans, as attested in the archaeological record by rapid invention of tools and of art, are something of the last 40, 50,000 years. So my personal guess is that agriculture rose at the end of this Ice Age and not 22 previous Ice Ages, because the missing condition was that we didn't have cognitively modern humans on the earlier occasions. Speculation. Dr. Gopher's remarks, let me comment on 2 points here. The dichotomy between conscious domestication and unconscious domestication, and the dichotomy between fast and slow domestication. It seems to me that one can find examples for both parts of the dichotomy. In the case of conscious domestication, the domestication of strawberries. Any of you who pick wild strawberries know that they're really small, but they vary in size. And any of you who bought strawberries in the supermarket know that domesticated strawberries are much bigger than wild strawberries. But wild strawberries vary in size. Wild strawberries, at least in the United States, are in thickets which are full of brambles and thorns, and it's hot and there are mosquitoes. So what is going to induce you to go into a thicket to harvest those wild strawberries? You're not going to waste your time plunging into the thicket among the mosquitoes and with the heat. If the strawberries are tiny, you're going to go into the thicket with the larger strawberries. So probably selection for a larger size in strawberries and some other plants was conscious, whereas in an area where the selection was surely unconscious was in the selection for non-popping peas. Namely, peas in the wild have popping pods, and the pods explode, and the peas are scattered on the ground. Essential in the domestication of peas was selection for a gene of non-popping pods that leave the pods non-popped and the peas are imprisoned in the pods. The earliest farmers who domesticated peas surely didn't know anything about the genetic control of popping versus non-popping. They simply gathered the peas that were available to them, which were the ones stranded up in the air because their pods did not pop. So there's an example of conscious domestication, selection for size in strawberries, and unconscious selection in the case of non-popping pods for peas. And my other example concerns fast versus slow domestication. There were some things that were probably domesticated rather fast and some things domesticated rather slowly. Domestication of wheat and barley was probably relatively fast because the changes involved are are slight, relatively slight from the wild to the domesticated form. The domestication of maize was a much slower affair because the wild ancestor of maize, teosinte, looks so different from domestic maize that for decades it was doubted that teosinte really was the ancestor of maize at all. Teosinte is a grass in which the seeds are enclosed in hard plastic-like stuff. If you look at teosinte, you would never get the idea that it would be domesticable. But in fact, teosinte in Mexico was domesticated, but it took a long time. And result of this is that there were villages in the Levant nourished already by wild wheat, because wheat in the wild state was so productive that villages even preceded domestication, whereas in the New World, maize was so difficult to domesticate and teosinte was such an unlikely candidate that it seems to have been something like 6,000 years after the beginning of domestication in Mexico that people settled down in villages. So there are examples of slow versus rapid developments. In the case of Dr. Harari's interesting comments, let me comment on two things, and in reverse order, reversing the order in which he presented them. The issue of humans and our livestock versus what the penguins are consuming. This can be rephrased in the question, how much of so-called primary productivity is now commandeered by humans? Primary productivity means the amount of sunlight that is captured by photosynthesis. How much of the captured photosynthetic output is now commandeered by us humans? There have been a series of studies beginning around 1986, and the studies of the 1980s suggested that already then humans are commandeering, that's to say, using for our crops or destroying by paving over with concrete. Already in 1986, we were commandeering something like 70% of the primary productivity fixed by sunlight. But the human population is growing, and it's clear that once humans are commandeering 100% of the primary productivity from sunlight, and there's nothing left for the poor penguins, there's also nothing left for further human population growth. That's another reason why we need to be concerned about the next several decades. The other point that I wanted to comment on was Dr. Harari's comment concerning the relative role of the power of the environment versus the power of ideas. One can make a progression in time that the power of ideas is becoming more important today, and perhaps the power of the environment was stronger in the past. I think of it also as a matter of scale. That's to say, the larger the time scale and the larger the spatial scale, the more important environmental factors become, whereas the smaller the time scale and the smaller the spatial scale, the more role individual humans exert. And the prime example of that is the reason why my wife exists today, namely that on July 20, 1944, when Count Stauffenberg pushed the bomb under the table at Rastenburg to kill Hitler, Count Stauffenberg pushed the bomb not quite far enough. And if he had pushed it another 50 centimeters, Hitler would have been killed on July 20, but he couldn't push it quite that far, so Hitler was wounded, not killed. The result, as we know, of Hitler's not dying on July 20, 1944, was that the World War in Europe went on for another year, and the result for the map of Europe is profound, including what happened to the borders between Poland and Germany, and what happened to the lives of my wife's mother and father and the existence of my wife. So there's an example of how on a small spatial and time scale, namely what happened in 20 minutes in a single room in Rastenburg on July 20, 1944. That had significance for the map of Europe today, but 500 years from now, will it make any difference? I don't know. And then finally, Dr. Even-Zohar's comments. Here, I'd like to mention two things. One, it is correct that I've been strongly influenced by natural experiments of history, and that's because, on the one hand, I've grown up working in laboratory science, working in the laboratory, doing experiments on gallbladders where I can manipulate the potassium bathing one gallbladder and not bathing another gallbladder. Those are manipulative experiments. But I also work on New Guinea birds. And with New Guinea birds, I cannot do manipulative experiments. If I want to understand why the long-bill sickle-bill, whether the long-bill sickle-bill competes with the short-bill sickle-bill, I could settle that question quickly if the government of New Guinea would permit me to go out and exterminate short-bill sickle-bills from various mountains, and then I could watch whether long-bill sickle-bills do or do not expand in range. Well, the government of New Guinea would not permit me to do that, and if it did permit me to do that, it would still be technically difficult, and finally it would be immoral. So one has to use other techniques. In working on field ecology, I learned early that one has to have different methods from the laboratory methods of manipulative experiments that work for the gallbladder. One has to use natural experiments. And natural experiments are also the method by which we learn in history. We cannot learn about history by using a time machine and going back and taking Aboriginal Australians, transplanting them to Europe 13,000 years ago, transplanting Europeans to Australia. If we could do that, we could quickly settle the role of people themselves in the different histories of Australia and Europe, but we can't do that in history. We have to depend upon natural experiments. And the other thing that I would like to comment on has to do with transmission by culture or by people. In the case of the spread of farming into Europe, there's been a long debate about whether farming spread from Anatolia into Europe through cultural diffusion, that's to say the hunter-gatherers of Europe getting the idea of farming and they themselves became farmers, or whether instead farmers from Anatolia invaded Europe. There's now substantial genetic evidence that there was a large role of farmers actually moving into Europe from Anatolia, carrying their genes, and it's an open question for modern Europeans how much of our genes are derived from the original hunter-gatherers and how much represent the genes of the invading farmers. The other example that I'd like to mention is in Africa, where it's clear that it went in both ways under different circumstances. So how did food production reach Southern Africa? Well, in one case it reached Southern Africa by cultural diffusion, and in another case it reached Southern Africa by the movement of people. The way that the Sand people at the Cape became herders, the way that herding arrived at the Cape was not that new people arrived at the Cape. Instead, the Sand people remained at the Cape of South Africa, but they acquired cows, sheep, and goats from the north something like 2,200 years ago, and they became herders. So here's an undoubted case of the rise of food production involving cultural transmission while the people remain the same. And the counterexample is that farming arrived in Southern Africa, in fact in most of sub-equatorial Africa, up as far as the Great Fish River, but not at the Cape itself, by genetic replacement, namely the descendants of black farmers in tropical West Africa spread throughout sub-equatorial Africa, replacing people related to the modern pygmies and the Sand people over large areas of Africa. So in some cases it's cultural transmission responsible for the spread of food production, and in other cases it seems to be movement of people. My impression, and I think the prevalent impression in the field nowadays, is that much more often there's movement of people, in part because the movement of the first farmers was just too fast and just too powerful to give the hunter-gatherers the opportunity to acquire food production by cultural transmission. It did happen for the Sand people of Southern Africa, but usually it did not happen. But those are just a few thoughts which overran for minutes in response to this rich smorgasbord, and I thank all the contributors to the smorgasbord for your stimulating ideas. Thank you very much.
Well, it has been a great honor, pleasure, and a privilege to be here and listen to all of our speakers, including myself. And, it's quite obvious why you have received the World Prize. But I now cordially invite you to join our unit, where you perfectly belong, because in my view, you are the ultimate cultural researcher around. Thank you very much for coming.